That noon, the sun hung high in the clear blue sky over Columbus, Ohio. Golden light poured down on Brookhaven, a neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly trimmed, as if the entire street had stepped out of a real estate magazine. Freshly painted white fences and gleaming windows reflecting the sunlight created a scene so peaceful, it seemed nothing could ever disturb it. A few neighbors strolled with their dogs on the sidewalks, coffee cups still steaming in hand. In the distance, a group of children raced their bicycles, their laughter ringing across the street. Somewhere, the steady hum of a lawnmower drifted through, blending with the cicadas of summer, evoking a rhythm of life that felt distinctly American. Neat, orderly, and seemingly detached from the injustices or chaos of the big city. Amid that calm, a patrol car bearing the Columbus Police logo rolled quietly forward, its tires gliding over the polished asphalt. Sergeant Mark Callahan sat inside, one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel, the other tapping a slow rhythm against the old radio, an old habit he had carried through 20 years in the force. For Callahan, streets like these were familiar territory, clean, safe, and easy to control. He believed this place was not meant for disorder, and that it was his job to keep it that way. Callahan carried the kind of confidence, bordering on arrogance, from wearing a uniform for so long. He had begun to believe his instincts were always right. Anything that looked out of place was a warning sign to his eyes. That belief, that he understood the rules better than anyone else, was about to ignite the biggest mistake of his career. The audience still sees a serene, picture-perfect setting. But beneath that surface, the story has already been quietly gathering energy, waiting for the slightest spark to explode. On the other side of the street, Simone Harris, a black woman in her early 40s with a fit, athletic build, moved steadily with each stride. Her hair was tied neatly back. Jazz music played softly through her earbuds, and her breathing was slow, controlled, and steady. Each step was a beat, a part of her daily routine for years. Her athletic outfit fit snugly against her toned frame, and her running shoes gleamed under the midday sun. Everything about her appearance spoke of discipline and endurance. Simone jogged past a silver Tesla parked in the driveway of a modern home, the sunlight flashing off its windows like a mirror. To her, it was just another moment in a familiar run. But to Callahan, the scene planted a different idea in his mind. Sitting in his car, Callahan's eyes locked onto Simone. A flicker of suspicion passed, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she didn't look toward the patrol car. In his mind, ordinary people usually glanced at the police, offered a nod, maybe even a polite smile, at least some acknowledgement of his presence. But Simone? She didn't care. Her music stayed on, her stride never faltered, and her eyes fixed straight ahead as though he didn't exist. A thought flashed through Callahan's mind like lightning. Something's not right. Instead of letting it pass, he let that instinct swell, convincing himself he needed to check. The patrol car eased over to the curb, its tires crunching lightly on gravel, leaving a heavy silence under the blazing sun. Simone sensed someone had stopped behind her. She removed one earbud and turned her head, her breathing still even though her eyes were now holding caution. In front of her, a middle-aged officer stepped out, one hand resting casually on his belt, close to his radio and handcuffs. It wasn't a move to draw a weapon, but enough to send a message. I have authority. "Is there a problem, officer?" Simone asked. Her voice touched with the breath of a runner, yet her gaze steady, without a hint of fear. Callahan stared hard at her, then pressed, "Where are you coming from?" Simone frowned slightly, answering crisply, "I just finished my run. My house is a few blocks away." Humor, but from the suffocating absurdity. "You mean that Tesla? So now jogging past a legally parked car counts as a crime? Her words cut clean, stabbing straight through the emptiness of his logic. But instead of stepping back, Callahan moved a step closer, his breathing heavier, his voice harder. "You're interfering with an investigation." Simone crossed her arms, her dark eyes glinting with defiance. "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm refusing to let you misuse your badge to harass me." Her words thickened the air around them. A few windows along the street creaked open, curious eyes peeking out. Across the road, a man was recording on his porch, phone in hand. Under the searing midday sun, the atmosphere suddenly grew heavy, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to explode. The atmosphere on the quiet street of Brookfield seemed to freeze. The midday sun poured down on the sidewalk, its glare bouncing sharply off the windows of the houses. But at the center, that peace had been torn apart by the tense exchange between a middle-aged police officer and a woman who had only been out for a run. Callahan's eyes burned with irritation. He was used to giving orders and having people obey, but Simone Harris stood there, arms crossed, not trembling, not yielding. It was no longer confidence to him, it was defiance. "You are obstructing an investigation," Callahan repeated, his voice stiff like words read from a training manual. Simone tilted her head, her tone slow but razor-sharp. "Investigation of what? I jogged past a car parked in a driveway. Since when has that become a crime?" The words were like a needle, widening the crack in Callahan's mask of composure. He drew in a deep breath, glancing around. A few residents in the neighborhood had started to notice. On the porch across the street, a man had lifted his phone, camera pointed directly at them. A woman near a mailbox had frozen, her eyes locked on the scene. Callahan felt every gaze pressing against him like an invisible weight. But instead of stepping back, he chose to assert his authority. He stepped forward until the space between him and Simone was less than an arm's length. "I won't ask again. Show me your ID." Simone inhaled deeply, her eyes unwavering. Her voice was low but rang out clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't carry ID when I run. And you know perfectly well the law doesn't require it. You stopped me simply because I don't fit the profile you think belongs here." The words slapped straight across Callahan's self-righteous belief. A vein pulsed at his neck. He stepped another half-step closer, his hand moving outward, deliberately flashing the handcuffs gleaming in the sunlight. In that moment, the tension reached a breaking point. Simone felt her heart pounding, not from fear but from recognizing something painfully familiar. Baseless suspicion, condescending eyes, and power wielded like a weapon. A heavy breath escaped Callahan. He lunged, seizing Simone's wrist and yanking it back. The sharp, "You don't know who I am." Callahan scoffed, his confidence dripping with disdain. "I don't need to know. All I need is to see your defiance." He didn't realize that with each passing second, the circle of onlookers was growing. Eyes watching, phones raised, whispers spreading. The once peaceful street had become a stage where his every move was being captured and would soon spread far beyond his control. The cold bite of the cuffs still pressed into Simone's wrist, the glint of metal catching the midday sun and lighting up the street as if it were ablaze. Callahan stood rigid, chest heaving, his eyes indifferent, as though he had just carried out a righteous duty. But he didn't realize that everything slipped out of his control when he snapped those cuffs on her wrist. The whispers grew louder. A young man on the corner muttered under his breath, "This is way out of line." A woman shouted from her front yard, "She was just jogging! What are you doing?" Callahan clenched his jaw, shutting it all out. Only one thought remained in his mind. "I can't back down. If I do, the whole street will think I've lost control." He pressed his radio, his voice clipped and stiff. "Dispatch, I have a 1015 female, resisting, Need transport immediately. Simone drew in a deep breath, holding her anger, before releasing words that froze the air. You just destroyed your career, Sergeant. Callahan faltered for half a second, then sneered with contempt. Tell me, who are you to judge me? Simone didn't answer. She lifted her head, eyes burning like fire, letting him believe he had won. But the onlookers saw something unmistakable in that gaze. She wasn't afraid. And then, at that very moment, a voice rang out from the distance, sharp, commanding, undeniable. Sergeant Callahan, what the hell do you think you're doing? The crowd turned in shock. From the far end of the street, a tall, imposing man in a suit strode forward, his jacket draped over one arm. He was no ordinary resident. The authority in his presence was undeniable. His eyes, cold and locked on Callahan, finally settled on the cuffs biting into Simone's wrist. Release her, immediately. The words weren't shouted, but carried such weight that Callahan staggered instantly. His hand tightened on his belt, forcing himself to stand tall. Sir, step back. This is police business. It doesn't concern you. The man narrowed his eyes, speaking slowly, each word falling like a stone on concrete. It concerns you more than you realize, Sergeant. For several seconds, the entire street held its breath. The air on Brookfield Street seemed frozen. The distant chirping of birds and the faint hum of traffic from the main road vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it was suffocating. Sergeant Callahan still gripped Simone's wrist tightly, his rough hand clinging to the handcuffs like they were his last tether to authority. But what unsettled him was not the woman in cuffs, the man in the suit who had just arrived, whose eyes burned with contempt, laced with undeniable power. I said, release her, the man repeated, this time his voice deeper, sharper, carrying such command that several in the crowd instinctively nodded, as though it were an order they too would obey. Callahan tried to cling to procedure, grinding out his words. She refused to cooperate. I have the right to detain her for investigation. A short, bitter laugh slipped from Simone, even with her wrist raw and reddened from the cuffs. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes, her voice quiet but carrying far enough for everyone around to hear. You just arrested the worst possible person you could in your entire career. The words sliced through the atmosphere like a blade. The crowd stirred, phones zooming closer, capturing Simone's face. Calm, resolute. The opposite of the suspect Callahan had tried to paint her as. Before Callahan could snap back, the low rumble of a black SUV's engine rolled in from the end of the street. It pulled up, stopping just meters away. The door swung open and out stepped Captain Ronald Briggs, Callahan's direct superior. The onlookers collectively gasped. Briggs' arrival felt like the tolling of a bell. The game is about to turn. Briggs advanced, his face cold, his eyes burning with restrained fury. He glanced at Callahan, then at the cuffs on Simone's wrist. In an instant, he understood everything. His voice cracked through the air, thunderous and absolute. Callahan, take the cuffs off. Now. The street erupted in whispers. Callahan froze, his face pale. He stammered. But she refused to show ID. I was just following procedure. Briggs stepped. Just handcuffed your own commanding officer. The crowd erupted. Phones vibrated as live streams flooded with comments. Callahan stood paralyzed, sweat running down his neck, his face stiff as stone. Every layer of arrogance, authority, and certainty crumbled in seconds. Simone lifted her chin, her voice ringing like steel. You thought you held power, but true power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from justice, and today, you trampled it." The street fell silent again, entranced by her words. And for Callahan, this was no longer just a lesson, a sentence. All of Brookfield Street seemed to hold its breath. Eyes from windows, lawns, phones, live streaming, every single one fixed on one man, Sergeant Brian Callahan. He stood motionless, his face pale, the hand that had just removed the cuffs still trembling, unable to drop to his side. The crowd's murmur rose and fell like waves crashing in his ears. The repeated whispers of Chief Daniels, rang out from the onlookers like a death knell for Callahan's career. Captain Briggs clenched his jaw, his eyes aflame. He was not the type to lose his temper easily, but in this moment, the veins at his temples throbbed, his restrained fury radiating an intensity that made everyone nearby lower their gaze. He strode forward and stopped less than half a meter from Callahan, his voice striking like a hammer. "Sergeant Callahan, you've crossed the line. You haven't just humiliated an innocent citizen. You've disgraced the honor of this entire department." Callahan tried to speak, his voice breaking. Captain, I didn't know." Briggs cut him off sharply. "Didn't know? A police officer's duty isn't to know every detail. It's to act properly until the facts are clear. And you let prejudice guide you. You wielded authority like a weapon, not a responsibility." The crowd fell silent. A middle-aged man on a porch shook his head and muttered, "He's just buried his own career." Simone Daniels stood tall, silently watching, her eyes void of gloating, only cold disappointment. And that, more than anything, made Callahan feel ashamed. Briggs extended his hand firm as steel. "Hand me your badge and your gun. Right now." A soft "oh" rippled through the crowd. They understood. This wasn't just an administrative order. This was a public judgment, delivered before dozens of eyes, and before the cameras streaming it live to social media. Callahan stood frozen. His chest rose and fell like he had just run a long distance. The badge on his chest felt suddenly heavy, the gun at his side like it was burning. He knew it was over once he removed them. Everyone. Serves him right. Who gave him the right to treat people like that? Callahan lifted his eyes bloodshot and met Simone's gaze. There was no anger, no triumph, only a heavy silence that made him feel smaller than ever. Briggs turned to the citizens, his voice clear and firm. "You can be assured of this. The Brookfield Police Department will never tolerate abuse of power. Justice must be upheld, even when the one at fault is one of our own." The crowd broke into scattered applause, not out of joy but in acknowledgement that justice had prevailed on this small street. Callahan whispered, barely audible, "Oh God, I've just buried my own life." But no answer came, only the silence surrounding him. And from that moment on, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. The air on Brookfield Street was so thick, it could have been cut with a knife. The scattered applause from moments earlier had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Every eye turned toward Chief Simone Daniels, the woman who had just been freed from handcuffs yet stood tall as though the whole world were her audience. Callahan lowered his head, retreating a few steps, his face flushed red, while Captain Briggs held the badge and gun in his hand, standing behind Simone like a pillar of justice itself. People held their breath from the sidewalks, the lawns, and even the surrounding houses' second-story windows, waiting to hear what would be said. Simone turned slightly, facing the crowd head-on. Her voice rang out, not loud, not rushed, but each word struck like a hammer blow to the chest. Today, before your very eyes, I was treated like a suspect simply for jogging on my own street. Not because I broke the law, not because I did anything wrong, but because I didn't look like what some people think belongs here. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. A middle-aged woman shook her head with a sigh. A young man gripped his phone tighter, live streaming with the caption, "Chief handcuffed on her own street. Where is justice?" Simone went on, her eyes sweeping across the faces before her. The problem isn't just one man's mistake. The problem is the danger of power in the hands of someone who believes their suspicion matters more than the truth. Today I was fortunate. I have rank. I have a voice. I have witnesses. But think about it. If I weren't the chief of police, if I were just an ordinary woman, who would believe me? Who would protect me? The atmosphere thickened. A man filming raised his camera higher. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, why did they arrest her if she didn't do anything?" Simone's voice dropped, her words sharp as arrows. This is not the first time, and I fear it will not be the last, unless we decide to change. Justice cannot be the privilege of those with titles. It must belong to everyone. The neighbor, uphold it. Today, you all witnessed it. And I hope from this moment forward, when you see injustice, no one will turn away again. As her words ended, a wave of applause erupted, this time intense, unrelenting, like a storm washing away the tension. Simone stood firm, one hand lightly resting on her chest, not bowing, but letting the silence after the applause speak for her. Faith had just been reborn on this street. Just minutes after Simone Daniels finished speaking, the phones raised high across the crowd had already captured everything, from when she was handcuffed to when she declared her message before the entire neighborhood. The video was uploaded to the internet almost immediately, and within just hours it spread across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Headlines on the clips exploded. Police handcuff the chief on her own street. Shock in Ohio. Jogger handcuffed. Turns out she's their boss. Chief Simone Daniels. A lesson in justice in everyday life. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares, and a flood of comments poured in. One Twitter user wrote, "If she hadn't been the chief, she would have been thrown in the car already. What's scarier is thinking about all those without a title to protect them." A woman commented on Facebook, "I have a 15-year-old daughter. Watching this video made me shiver. Because if tomorrow she goes out to exercise and someone doubts her just because of her skin color, who would believe her?" On TikTok, a short clip of Simone saying, "Justice cannot be a privilege," went viral as audio, spliced into countless videos, some serious, some parodies, but all contributing to the spread of the story. It wasn't just social media. Mainstream news outlets quickly picked it up. The next morning, CNN, NBC, and the New York Times carried the story. Legal experts appeared on television, analyzing the case. The issue isn't that she was the chief. The issue is that thousands of others have lived through the same thing, but nobody knew. Nobody believed them. This is a stark reminder that bias can turn an ordinary act, like jogging, into suspicion, simply because of how you look. Community organizations and anti-racism movements immediately seized on the incident as a new symbol. Posters went up across Columbus, Cleveland, and beyond. Simone standing tall with the words, "Respect is not optional." Meanwhile, the Brookfield Police Department plunged into crisis. The chief's office was bombarded with emails, calls, and demands to investigate Sergeant Callahan's actions. The Change.org petition amassed over 250,000 signatures in just 72 hours, calling for reform and mandatory anti-bias training across the force. Callahan's name became Daniels quietly became the face of a message far larger than herself. Justice is not something to be doubted. It must be the standard. As the final applause in the shopping center faded, Sergeant Daniel Callahan sat motionless in the patrol car. His hands rested on the steering wheel, powerless, his empty gaze drifting over the pristine houses, the neatly trimmed fences, and the lush lawns of Brookfield. Everything looked the same as it always did, but the entire world had changed for Callahan. He had just lost the most essential thing in his life, his trust in himself. The clicks of the crowd's phones still haunted him like invisible bullets. Each camera raised had not only recorded the moment he handcuffed Chief Simone Daniels, but also exposed a more painful truth. The prejudice he had carried for years was now laid bare, undeniable. The badge that had been with him for 2 decades was stripped from his chest, his gun taken away. To others, they were just tools. But for Callahan, they were honor, career, and pride. Now, all that remained was the red mark on Chief Daniels's wrist, an image that would follow him for the rest of his life. He remembered her gaze. No anger, no vengeance, only deep disappointment. And that was what suffocated him most. Back in the familiar neighborhood, Callahan saw how the looks of the residents had changed. The man who used to greet him each morning now only crossed his arms in silence. The child who once waved excitedly at the patrol car now hid behind his mother. Even his colleagues avoided stepping near him. Suddenly he understood. Isolation did not begin with suspension. It began when trust collapsed. Night fell. His apartment glowed with the cold blue light of the TV screen. The news replayed repeatedly. Sergeant in Brookfield suspended after wrongly arresting his own chief. The footage of him twisting Simone's arm in broad daylight rolled on repeat. The anchor's voice pounded in his ears like relentless blows. In the darkness, he remembered Simone's cutting question. "How many others have you done this to?" The words bored deep into him. He knew the answer would never be 0. There had been a time he stopped a boy just for standing too long in front of a lovely house. The time he demanded ID had witnessed. If Simone Daniels hadn't been the chief, if she had been just an ordinary woman, would anyone have believed her? Would anyone have freed her? The scene on Brookfield Street ended with an image as symbolic as it was unforgettable. Chief Simone Daniels standing tall, uniformed shoulders squared, her calm gaze burning with quiet fire. Around her, neighbors, faces that had once watched in silence, now looked at her not with curiosity but with respect. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove herself with papers or titles. Her composure and truth had already stripped a veteran sergeant of his badge before the community he once claimed to protect. And in that moment, everyone understood. Justice is not in the power of the uniform itself, but in how that power is used, to protect or to oppress. Simone spoke little. As Briggs guided her toward the waiting SUV, she turned back, eyes sweeping over the crowd. Her voice carried just enough. "Don't think today is just a story between me and a sergeant. This is the story of anyone who has ever been misjudged, ever treated as though they didn't belong. Every glance, every camera, every nod you gave today proves that truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand firm. The murmurs spread, swelling into scattered applause, not loud but steady, like the rhythm of beating hearts in unison. The people understood. This was no longer about a single incident. It was a warning to the entire system. Sergeant Callahan walked away quietly, leaving behind a heavy void. But that void was instantly filled by Simone's presence, a woman who turned humiliation into a living testament of dignity, fairness, and the truth that no prejudice can erase a person's worth. Her final words hung in the air like a call to action. Today's story isn't just about one officer and one chief. It's a reminder that sometimes truth needs someone to stand up for it. If you believe stories like this must be told, hit like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people will realize justice begins with how we treat each other every single day.